And now joining us from the Hoover Institution on the campus of Stanford University is Abbas Milani, who is the Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford and a Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he is the co-director of the Iran Democracy Project. He is also the author of this book, The Shah. Dr. Milani, when was the Shah in power and how did he get there?
He was in power from 1941 and left in 1979 and gave his seat to Ayatollah Khomeini unwillingly as a result of a revolution that I argue in the book was hijacked by the clerics. It wasn't supposed to lead to a clerical despotism. It was a movement against what people thought was his authoritarianism. He came to power when his father, Reza Shah, was pushed out of power when the Allied forces occupied Iran in 1941, particularly the British and the Soviets. And they were worried, the Allies were worried that Reza Shah was a little too friendly to the Nazis. There were about, depending on who you ask, 1,000 to 3,000 German experts working in Iran. And when the Soviet army suffered its early defeats, resupplying it became very critical, and the Iranian railroad that connected the Persian Gulf to the Caspian would enable the Allies to resupply the Red Army. So occupying Iran became essential, getting rid of the Nazis became essential. So this young man at the young and tender age of 22 almost reluctantly became the king.
Reluctantly, you say?
I think so, because first of all, he wasn't at that time anticipating that he was going to ascend to the throne. He wasn't anticipating that he's going to ascend to a throne of a virtually occupied country. And finally, my sense of it, and that's the sense that I try to convey in the book, is that he really wasn't, by inclination, a public man. He was not someone who had the drive that his father had, that basically grabbed the throne and made it his own. He was very weak inside, but also pretended to be very strong. He was, I quote Shakespeare, there was like a hare that roared like a lion, and hares that roar like lions make bad politicians. And in that sense, he was a reluctant but modernizing leader who came to power at a very crucial time in a very critical piece of real estate. Iran, as Truman, FDR, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, virtually all the presidents have said, is one of the most important countries. And remember, those were the days of the Cold War. Iran had 2,500 kilometers of common borders with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was known to be trying to get into the Persian Gulf, get its hands on the Persian Gulf oil. So keeping Iran out of the Soviet bloc's hand was very critical. So Iran is almost by consensus, scholarly consensus, where the Cold War began. So you have a young man, tested, or as Shakespeare would say, with metal untested, comes to a very critical throne in a troubled land with the rise of a communist movement suddenly, supported by the Soviet Union. So all of this made it very interesting and critical.
Well, you've mentioned Shakespeare a couple of times. Dr. Milani, you begin each chapter in The Shah with a quote from Shakespeare's King Richard. Why?
There is, first of all, Seinfeld would say, Shakespeare aficionado. I love Shakespeare. And, but reading, when I read Richard II, I found striking similarities between both the character of Richard, this vacillation between authority when he felt powerful and absolute weakness when he felt besieged, and going from one extreme to the other with almost no in between. That's virtually the character that the Shah has. He goes from the height of his power, where he spends $150, $200 million to invite all the heads of state. I'm sure you remember the 2,500 year of monarchy in Iran, where he literally threatened President Ford verbally to someone within a year and a half couldn't make a single decision without prior approval of the American ambassador. It's very much like Richard. And, you know, Richard's reign is when the whole question of divine legitimacy and whether divine legitimacy can be a sustained phenomena in the modern age is questioned by Shakespeare. Shakespeare has some brilliant lines in there where Richard says, you know, you can kill me, you can get rid of me, but God has anointed me, and only God can take away this throne. But people took away the throne that Richard and the Shah both thought are God's gift to them.
Throughout his reign, 1941 to 1979, of those years, how many of them did he have to answer to the British, to the Americans, to another authority prior to making big decisions?
I think from 1941 to 1964-5, he is, in the words of the American ambassador at the time, a ward of the United States. He really has to answer to both the British and the Americans. There is very little that he can do without their prior approval. He's dependent on their help. The U.S. poured in almost $1 billion from 1953 to 1962 in Iran. Iran was probably second or first recipient of foreign aid in that period. So when you have the purse, you have the power to dictate, and the United States told them how much money to spend on military, what things to do. And ironically, you know, the independence that oil money got him, I think proved to be his undoing. Because first of all, he became arrogant. He no longer had to listen to Americans. We kept advising him virtually through the entire period of his reign that you should open up the system. You should democratize. You should bring the middle class into the fold. And when he had all the money in the world, after the hike in the price of oil, he didn't feel like he needed to listen to the Americans. And furthermore, with that money, he really changed Iran. The fabric of Iranian society changed. There was now middle class. There was a large urban working class that brought with them from the villages conservative cultural values. There was no force in the country that was allowed to participate, to mobilize this new urban multi-million force. The only force that was allowed to work in these neighborhoods, in these areas, were the clergy. So when the system went into crisis, not surprisingly, the clergy were the ones who had the political muscle to win, to essentially seize this movement that was hoping to create a democracy, but ended up creating a theocracy.
Abbas Milani, did the Shah always have a tenuous relationship with the mullahs?
That's a very interesting question. It's one of the more, I think, less known aspects of his character. On the one hand, he picked a big fight with the mullahs in 1963. That's when Khomeini came to the national stage, and he eventually exiled Khomeini from Iran, and it was Khomeini that came back to unseat him. But the Shah, as you probably know, fled Iran in 1953, and with the help of the clergy and the Americans and the British, he was brought back to power. So he had this fraught relationship, and while he despised radical clergy like Khomeini, he felt that the rest of the clergy, the body religious, are his allies in the fight that he thought were the determining fights of the time. The same idea that was at the time popular in the United States, that communism is the main threat, that any force that is willing to stand up to the communists is a potential ally of the United States. That's exactly what the Shah thought. That's why he had a scorched earth policy about everybody else, but allowed these guys